Hi everyone, this is Tom. So today I would like to talk to you about macro hygiene. So if this is the first time that you are programming macros or so-called metaprogramming, you may find this session useful. Okay. To illustrate what kind of problems related to hygiene in macros, what I would do is to create a simple example, and I will try to show you what kind of problems that I would be facing when I write this macro, and you will be able to see what I've done wrong, and so that when you do it yourself, you will not have any problem. Okay, so we're going to try a fun example today. Okay, and here's a macro I'm going to write. The macro will take two arguments. Number one, it will take a function. And number two, it will take an expression argument. And what it will do is it will apply that function on that expression one time, and then use the same function to apply to the result of that previous expression again, and do it one more time. So it total do it 3 times. And then it will return 3 values in the tuple. Okay, so here's how I'm going to write it. And I'm going to call it inception. All right. Function f expression. Okay. As it's writing with macros, I will use a quote block. Okay. And with that, I will first assign the value by applying function f over the expression. You know what? Actually, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to just apply to that original expression. And then I will assign a second variable y, which will be applying function f over to the value of x. And I will do that again with z, where I would be applying the same function again on the value of y, right? And at the end, I will just return x, y, and z. Okay, simple enough, right? So let me just save it. And I will use macro hygiene over here. And I will start testing it. Before I do that, I would have to export it so that I can use the macro more easily, right? And so from here, if I try to call that macro, I'll apply the sine function over the value of 1. Do it 3 times, I got 3 values. So this is working great. The first time that I'm writing a macro is already working. All right. So if I'm a beginner, I'm going to just walk away and have fun with other coding. But there's a problem with this macro. I'm going to show you what the problem is. Okay. So as a user of the macro, okay, I might be doing a lot more complicated stuff than this simple example, right? What if I'm doing something like this? Let's say I have defined the variable x with 100, right? And then I will want to call this macro with the value of x. Okay, that sounds reasonable enough, isn't it? Now, if I try to run it, I got this strange error. Okay, and this is not something that you've seen before. I have a variable name over here that looks very funny, right? Pound 767 pound x, and it's telling me that this variable is not defined. Okay. Now my macro doesn't show that at all, and so I wonder where it came from. Okay. So as we always do to debug macros, I will use this macro expand macro itself. Okay. And I will pass that expression in here, and it will show me what the macro is expanded to. Now you can look at the variable x, y, and z. They're now having this funny symbol. And the problem came about on the very first line, right? Because it's trying to assign a variable to a variable itself, it's kind of like having x equals x, right? But that wouldn't work in this case because the x over here is not yet defined, right? And the reason why there is a problem is because actually Julia's doing something good for you. Is trying to keep the macro clean by assigning these automated variables. And when they're being used locally, right? In this case, this variable is being used in here, and that y variable is being used over here, right? And when they're being used locally, it should be okay. But that very first line is problematic because it's mistakenly using the x variable from the user environment and as if it's one inside the macro, right? So that doesn't work. So Julia actually have a way for you to fix it, and it is a function called escape, ESC. Okay, so if you look at the docstring over here, it tells you that you can prevent the macro hygiene path from turning embedded variables into Gensim variables. So what we were seeing over here in this expanded code, these are called the Gensim variables. Okay, so when I first learned about macro, I do this quite often. I would just put this escape function over on this quote block, right? And I will just keep everything clean, right? And so let's give that a try, okay? So now that I've saved that file and I'm coming back to this repo, I will do that test one more time, okay? And in fact, I'll do the simple one first. I'll do sign one. It seems to work fine, right? So I'll do x equals 1. Okay. And then I'll do sign of x. And it also works fine here, okay? So I'll say, the escape function is working just fine. Can it stop here and be done with it? And the answer is no. It is not working fine yet, okay? Let's take a look at the expanded version again, right? So macro expand, inception. Now you look at the code, it actually is not using any Gensim variables, including the y, z, and x, okay? In fact, the very first line is kind of like doing nothing. It's doing x equals x. It happens to work because I set x equals 1 first, and then I call that macro. And so when that macro runs, x already has a value of 1, right? So this line works just fine because it's assigning x with the value of 1. And so this macro is problematic. And to illustrate what kind of problem this brings upon, you can actually do something like this, okay? So let's say z is something that I have never defined before, but why is it there already, okay? And that's because when the macro was run earlier, right, x, y, and z, they were actually being computed not inside the macro, but rather being exposed to the user environment. And so, in fact, I will now see both x, y, and z, all three values, in my local environment, right? So this is not cool, okay? And now, to fix that, there's one way to do it, and I'm going to show you this way, which is when Julia is not expanding and generating the Gensim variables, you can do it yourself, okay? So I could have done something like this, okay? X, Y, and Z equals Gensim, Gensim, and Gensim, okay? So with those three variables, now having Gensim variables, I can now interpolate them inside the quote block okay, for every reference that I can see X, Y, and Z. Okay, so if I do that and I try to look at the expanded version, I can see that it's actually working fine this time, right? So you have this X variable being generated with a gensim variable name, and likewise with Y and Z. Okay, so if I would have done, let's say W equals 1, okay, and I do that, run the inception macro with the value of W, right? It continue to work fine, and the value of W stays the same because it's not being polluted by the macro. Y and Z were there only because that I ran something before. You can see that if I do W equals 555, right, and I run that inception macro, Y and Z hasn't changed, still the original one, because the new macro that I just defined here works perfectly. Okay, so this version of inception actually works and is totally fine. Okay, now there's a potentially one more problem actually. I'll bring that upon over here. And that problem comes about when I have to reference a function inside this package. So let me do this. I will define a function called double. Okay, and all it does is to take that value x and double it up and times 2. Okay, and so assuming that I'm going to change the inception macro now, and I want to double the value of the expression first before going through that 3-step process. Okay, and so how would I do this? I'll do this double over here, right? So this double function will call, that double will be called, and so I should be able to test it now. Okay, and I'll do it the simple way, inception sign of 1, and I should see, what? It's not working. What's going on? Double not defined. I have the function defined. What's happening? Okay, let's debug it again. I will use macro expand again to see what's happening. And this time I just do the simple version with sign of 1. And you look at the expanded code, it looks fine, but it's actually not fine, okay? Because you have to look at the expanded macro from the perspective of the user, okay? In this repo, I am in a special module called main, right? And so when I call double, it's not there because that's not in my environment. What I really need to do is to call the double function inside the macro hygiene module, right? But the macro is not doing that for me. So in order for me to make a fix to this macro, I would have to prefix the function name with the module name, like that, right? So now I know this double function has to be the one inside macro hygiene. Okay, so let me try to expand that one more time to get some good feeling about it. Yeah, so now this is being generated correctly, and let's test it. And it's working fine now. All right, so as a quick summary, right, when we use the escape function over the quote block like this, there are 2 things I need to do, right? Any local variables like x, y, and z, I should really replace them with a gensim variable. And any reference to functions defined inside this macro hygiene module, I should prefix them with the macro hygiene module name. All right. So those are the 2 things we have to remember doing when we write this macro. But now you look at this code, it's not very readable. You got dollar sign all over the place, right? And you have to do gensim for every variable that you use inside that quota block. Okay, so perhaps there's a better way. So I will show you a different way to write this now. Okay, and let me start something new here. I'm still going to call it inception, but maybe that one I'll just rename that to old. Okay, and first I'll start with what we started originally. Right, so this is how it used to look originally. And the second way to write that same function is we're still going to have to use the escape function, but this time I will use it inside the quote block, right? And only for that expression. Because of that, I would have to escape it first before I interpolate. And I have to do that not just for the expression, actually, because I want to escape everything that's being provided by the user, right? So because this macro has two arguments, I should really escape both of them, right? Both f and ex. Okay, and so let me try to do a quick test over here. I'll do another test with a variable being set from the user environment, calling it that. Right, so everything seems to work just fine. And let's take a quick look at the expanded macro as well. Right, so now that we've seen a couple of times, this looks perfectly fine. I still want to run the double function, right? So let's do this here. Now, because I am not putting the escape function over the whole quotes block, this double actually refers to the double function inside the macro hygiene module. And let's prove it by expanding it. There we go. So you can see that the double function here is properly referencing the double function inside this module. Okay, so now this code, I would have to say, is much more readable than the other one. It's not completely clean yet, but I think it looks pretty good. Okay, now, so in summary, the second way to write this macro is to put the escape function over any user-provided argument to the macro. And you do that for every reference inside the quote block. Okay. Now, to make it even more readable, assuming that you have a large quote block, right, and you have the expression being used in a number of places, doing that escape everywhere is probably not going to be very nice. As you can see here, I have escape f twice already, right? The good thing about that is that you can actually pre-compute it outside of the quote block, right? So you can do escape f, ex equals escape ex, okay? And then, so from here, you can just do the regular ex being interpolated and the f function being interpolated, okay? So now this quote block is actually back to what it used to be, and it looks very clean, right? With the exception that I have to escape them ahead of time. Let's expand it one more time to see what it looks like. And sure enough, it works the same way as before, okay? And so today we have seen two ways to use the escape function. One way is to escape over the whole quote block, but then you have to remember using gensim and also prefixing the functions with your module name. And the second way of doing it is to escape the user-provided arguments that's coming into the macro. So my preference is the second way. Okay. By now, I have written a lot of code with the first way, but maybe later on I will start changing them and updating them so that my code becomes a lot more readable. Okay. All right. So that's all I want to share with you today. Thank you very much for watching. Would you like more tips about Julia programming? If you haven't seen the hands-on design patterns and best practices with Julia book, this is a good time to take a look. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.